All right, here we are, part 2. Zoom free accounts are fun. They kick you out every 45 minutes, but we're back. So let me share my screen. That would probably help. Yes. All right, welcome back. Okay, so we were talking about these. I think we're done. Yeah.
Grid operation and deconstruction, and it's a similar sort of like, yeah, just shortcuts and.
Yep. Okay. Oh, yes. One more thing about routes is dynamic segments. So I was talking earlier about I had up here Git organizations, and then I had this symbol, which is again this Ruby variable that is where the variable itself is immutable. Like I'm never going to need to. So it's a local variable where you never need to change the string that represents the variable itself. Rails uses symbols pretty frequently to refer to various things.
Zach and Joel, I guess, does this look similar to you? Like, I think it sounds exactly the same as how you put a variable into like a path, like a URL path when you're using a router.
Yeah, I think that's the same idea.
That's what I'm assuming as well, but yeah.
Yeah, so in this case, what this would take is if I literally went to localhost 3000 organizations/1, then the way that dynamic segments work, and this is going to come in to play when we look at dev2, is it is going to store this number in a hash as the value to this key, or you would call it a name in a JavaScript object, right? And the hash is called params. So if we got to, what are we doing right now? Organizations show. So in organizations show, we would get here, and you can actually see it being called here. I have access to a hash, which is what we would call a JavaScript object that didn't have any functions in Ruby. So in Ruby, and I didn't talk about this in syntax, a hash is something like name, value, other name. Yeah, I'll put it, camel case for you guys and folks. Right.
Yeah,
so
your key value pair.
Yeah, so these are your key value pairs. So essentially they're dumb JavaScript objects. They're not going to have methods, but it is a list of key value pairs. I'm not sure if there's something more like this. Is that a dictionary, or is that a different thing to think about?
Dictionary, I think, is Python. Objects in JavaScript also, like, you don't usually have methods in objects. That's usually when you have like a class specifically.
Okay, got it. Yes. So params is a hash, and it's going to come through with and maybe I might be able to demonstrate this live later, but when there is a dynamic segment in the route, it's going to come through with a key value pair where this is the key and this is the value. So I would be able to do params ID and be able to grab that and do stuff with it. And so you can see they are doing something with it, which I'm going to segue into now. Yes, I think we can. The one thing I want to say before we move on is when you have a Rails app running, when you have a Rails app and you're in the working directory of the Rails app, at the terminal line, you can input Rake Routes, and it will output all of the routes that are available to your Rails app. And that can be helpful, especially when you have a really complicated routes.rb file where they're using a bunch of different ways to like meta program the routes like they do in our dev2 app, to see like what are the actual routes that I could put into the nav bar and see what happens, or what could I send requests to.
I was just gonna say it almost looks like the way they would if they were hand rolled, if you're kind of like getting lost in like that resources syntax.
Yes, exactly.
And Ellie and Phil, I think, showed me, was it Rake Routes -C and the name of the controller? Unless you filter just by that specific controller.
I don't doubt it. I have never done that in my life, so
because
I'm
they have
learning.
a bajillion routes on this one.
So what I'll do is rail routes -G, like gorilla or giraffe. I don't know what G is, but and just put the keyword in. So it doesn't even necessarily have to be the controller. It could just be any word associated with any part of that route. So that's how I almost never actually look at the routes.rb file unless I'm adding to it. If I'm looking at an actual route, I almost always do it in the terminal with Rails routes, just because for me it's easier to read. I know everyone does it differently, but for me it's just easier to read in the terminal because everything is hand rolled and explicit. So
yes. Let's go ahead and let's demo this because I agree this is really helpful. So I'm going to do, and I said Rake routes, and you probably heard Ryan say Rails routes. They are interchangeable. Rake is a task. It's really hard to explain what Rake does. Maybe Google it. But anytime that you would do a Rails command like Rails routes or Rails DB, and you'll see some Rails console, you can almost always interchange it with Rake console and vice versa. So when you're looking at documentation or Stack Overflow or whatever, and you see people doing stuff with Rake, and you're like, what the heck is Rake? I don't. It is a task bundling tool, and it by default, when you're in a Rails app, is it can kind of stand in for Rails. That's a bad way of explaining it, but so I'm going to do Rake routes, and it's going to take a second because this is a really long file. Yeah, all right. And my terminal does not display it very prettily, so I'm going to scroll up here. But you can see on a given line, we've got wow, this is so long.
hey, Daniel, if you just
Yes.
do try doing like Rake routes -G, maybe stories or something.
Yeah, let's do organizations because that's what we were talking about here.
Yeah.
Thank you. Excellent. So at the top, if it's short enough list, it does give you column names for what these are. The prefixes you can ignore. They're used for basically shortcuts to refer to the path to a particular resource. The verb, obviously, you want to pay attention to. The URI pattern is the most important part of this. You can kind of ignore this :: format. I have never paid attention to that. It's probably relevant to somebody. But then you have this controller action column, which is obviously really helpful for going and actually finding it. And you can see here that the stuff that's inside of a namespace, it tells you, hey, it's in the admin folder, in the organizations, and then you would look for something with _controller.rb, and then look for the new method. Cool. So yes, very helpful. I'm going to try to add that .g thing because that's super, super helpful. All right, so we're going to talk about what happens in the controller. Like high-level controllers are task-specific Ruby classes, and this is true of most stuff in a Rails app. It's all Ruby classes, but they're tailored towards specific jobs in the Rails ecosystem. And this was a really helpful summary from the docs. It is a class. It inherits from application controller, and it has methods just like any other class. When your application receives a request, the routing, and you can read here like routes.rb, will determine which controller and action to run. Then Rails creates an instance of that controller and runs the method with the same name as the action. Okay. So if we go back to the app here, we're looking at this internal organizations controller. We already kind of walked through how we got here. let's say that we were going to the show. One quick thing about why it's relevant that what it inherits from. This is the syntax for how, can you all still see what I'm looking at?
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
So this is the syntax for making a class inherit from another class. And I don't know how much you guys have done. How much have you guys folks done with inheritance?
Extends is the version for us, and
Okay.
We've had experience with it, some exposure to it on a handful of projects now.
Awesome. So this is the syntax. You do a lesser than symbol and then the name of the class that you want it to inherit from. You can see that you sometimes have classes that are inside another namespace. So the double colon is called the namespace or scope resolution operator. And it basically says that this class is is within this namespace. And so right now, this internal namespaced organizations controller is inheriting from a internal namespaced application controller. So I'm going to look inside the internal, the app/controller/internal folder, and there should be an application controller here, which is specific to the internal namespace. This one in turn inherits from just plain old application controller, and that's the critical one that is found in the controllers directory. And this one in turn inherits from action controller base, which is hidden in the innards of the Rails code. And this one kind of does, you know, all the under the hood stuff. But the reason why they provide it to this sort of middle layer here is so that you can add methods that you want every single controller to inherit. And it's often where you would put things like user authentication, cookie interactions, session interactions, and other stuff that you want every controller to have access to across the whole site. So if we look down here, there will be stuff about current user. So if we look for authenticate user, that's the user authentication logic. There is stuff about handling bad requests, unauthorized requests, routing errors. All of these methods are accessible to any class that inherits from application controller. So I'm pointing that out because sometimes you'll find yourself in a situation where your controller is calling a method that you do not see defined anywhere, and that can be extremely confusing. So it's good to know that this is probably a good first place to look, and just to follow the path of like what other classes is this class inheriting from, and then it can also include modules, and this might be also like the extend keyword in JavaScript, but modules are like classes, but they do not have state. They don't have instance variables or class variables. They only have methods. And so when you include a module, I'm assuming that's what this is. I'm pretty positive, but we can go look for it under, actually, I don't know where they live.
I think it's helpers.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
JK.
No,
Wrong.
we're gonna pretend we didn't go down this rabbit hole, but they're in here somewhere.
Command P. Command P.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's find session current user. We would probably, here it is. Yep. So there's somewhere else in the app, there is a module defined. The syntax is very similar to a class. Modules can extend other modules, but basically it's exactly like inheritance, except that, well, I shouldn't say that. It's like inheritance. I'm gonna get in trouble when anybody who knows what they're talking about watches this video. Yes. Anyway, application controller. those are some of the places you might look if you see a method being called that you don't see defined within the class itself. Is just kind of follow that chain of what other things are being inherited, what modules are being extended or included. All right, I need to get down to, because we're going long in the tooth here, to get into what's happening in the controller. So here's the critical thing for understanding controllers. By default, a controller action will render the view file corresponding to that controller and action. So if you take this one that I made up, or I stole it from the Rails docs, class, client's controller, which inherits from application controller, def new, end, would render app / views / clients / new .html.erb. That's without even having to do anything in this method. It could be completely empty. It will go and it will attempt to render this file. And I will give you a more concrete example. So if we were looking at, no, we don't want that. Obviously, we've all been doing a lot of stuff with the reading list. If we take this one as an example, we could go to, kind of trace it all the way through. So let's go to config routes. I am going to jump to it because I can't remember exactly. So on line 365 of the routes file, there's a get / reading list. And this is, if we look at dev.2 and mouse over reading list, you can see down in the bottom left corner that this is the path that this button is going to. HTTP, pointing with my physical finger, and it's just occurring to me that no, you can't see that. dev2 / reading list is where this button goes to. So it would come down, the routes file is read from top to bottom, so it would try to match things from the top, and it would keep looking for matches until it got to line 365. And say, all right, found a match. We're going to route to reading list items index. So I'm going to go to app / controllers, reading list items underscore controller.rb. And we're going to run the index function. So in here, we've got an instance variable being declared with a Boolean value. And then there are two, I'm going to assume that these are methods getting called because they're not being given a value, which I would expect if they were local variables. So I'm going to look for set view on this page, and it brings me down to this private method, def set view. In here, another instance variable is getting declared, and it's going to store whatever the return is from this if block, which is a nifty bit of syntax that we just learned existed. So but I say, okay, if the params view, and we're not sure where this came from at the moment, but if, well, yeah, actually, we probably could. So if we go down one layer in the routes file, you can see that there's another route that is a dynamic segment of view, right? If we go to the reading list and we mouse over view archive, take a look at the path in the bottom left corner. dev2 / reading list / archive. Okay, so if I clicked on this button, I would hit this route. It routes to the same action, right? But in this case, instead of hitting the else and having @view be valid, it would hit if params view is archive, and it would set @view to archived. So just keep that in mind. So we have an @view instance variable that's floating around with a value as of line 4. So on line 5, we've got, it runs another method, generate Algolia search key. So I'm going to go down here. It declares a local variable, params, and it sets it to this hash, right? Because the curly braces in Ruby are an indication that this is a hash. This is an alternative way of declaring a hash in Rails or
Can
in
you
Ruby.
briefly explain what a hash is again?
Yeah, so a hash is a list of key value pairs,
Got it.
like a JavaScript object. Yeah. So this is happening. It's doing some stuff with session current user ID. What do you say? Interesting. Like where's that value? And it's not in this file, right? So we look at, if we do what we just recommended doing earlier, we're going to go back to application controller, and we're going to look here for session current user ID. Not in here. And then we might start looking in these. So if I open up this file again, I'm going to do find all in project. I'm going to go to this thing, and then I found it. Here we go. And we can see that this method returns, and return by itself breaks the execution of the method and returns whatever follows it. In this case, it goes straight into a conditional. So it's saying like, unless on the session variable, there's this key, return. And because there's nothing here, it would just return nil. But presumably if this did exist, then the return value of this method would be this, the last line of the method. Session order.user.user.key.first.first. And so this is probably, I'm assuming that somewhere in the process of logging in the user's user ID or some kind of authentication piece of information has been stored in a session so that it can be referred to on all the other pages of the app, on all the other controllers. All right, so now we're back. So we figured out what this is. Filters. The filters key has been set to viewable by this user's probably ID, stored in params, and then we declare an instance variable, which is Algolia. So we have a capital A. So this is a class dot generate secured API key, and it passes in some other stuff that we don't know and the params. And this is getting past the complexity that we need to understand for this. But what I want to point out is that this is going to return something. We could go look at the Algolia class.
This is just fetching the API key from that API file because Algolia is like the search API.
Yeah, but by this point, we still haven't been told explicitly to render anything, and so it's gonna go to the default. And so typically, to make explicit what's happening, I'm gonna write it out. So what's happening at the end of every controller action is render, and then I need my backenders to help me out. I want to say it's render index. Is that right? Do I have any?
You're right. I think you could do like the symbol too. Didn't we do a symbol at some point?
We might have done a symbol.
It doesn't really matter, but
It could be a symbol or it could be a string, and that's going to instruct Rails to look for to render a view file corresponding to this name in the folder that corresponds with the name of the controller. So again, it's going to go to app/views/reading list items and then it's going to look for a file that is before the file extensions matches the name of the controller action, which exists. And so here we are. This is what is going to get rendered. And so now we're into the view layer. So I'm going to pop back over to my stuff here, make sure I'm not forgetting anything.
Daniel, you could also mention you usually render ERB or a view, but if this is an API, of course you're going to be rendering not a view file, but you'll render JSON.
Yes.
So that's like an important distinction. You'll see that within like the request folder of the test, you can see where they test their API, and instead of going to ERB or JavaScript, they're actually pulling back JSON. So they're hitting a URI like dash articles, and it's coming back with like key value pairs of each article or something like that. And that's like a thing that Rails can do too.
Yes, excellent. And I just opened up that subdirectory here in Atom, and sure enough, under the views/API/v0/articles, you can see that instead of ERB files, they have these .json.jbuilder files, which I don't know exactly how those work, but I'm assuming they are, some different kind of file format that puts together JSON. So it doesn't necessarily need to be an ERB file, but typically, you're probably going to be rendering either HTML or JSON, depending on whether you have a front end, a Rails app with a front end, or whether it's a back end Rails app that's functioning purely as a server-side API. So, yeah, good point, Josh. Thanks.
Can I ask real quick? And if this is too far off the pattern right now, in the controller, is the dev2 ever, instead of rendering an ERB, rendering like a React file? Or are they all going to ERB and then the React files are being called from within the ERB?
So as far as I've seen so far, they're all going through the ERB file first. And I'm gonna, this is actually a really good example because it shows where that handoff seems to occur. So let me make sure.
I don't want to like jump us forward or sideways.
No, I think this is a good point to jump into it, because that's where this example doesn't rely upon the model a whole lot. So we'll talk about the view for a second, and then we'll jump to talking about the model. So in this ERB file, and ERB stands for Extended Ruby, and wait, no, not extended. Embedded Ruby. And it basically lets you embed Ruby code within a different file format. So typically you'll see this with .html.erb files, but you can also have other things .rb, like .text.erb is a format that you see often in the email side of Rails we need to get into. But the way that it looks is this. You have angle braces and percentage symbols containing Ruby code. And they come in two varieties. There are invisible ERB tags, which do not render their contents into the file. And you have visible ERB tags, which have this equals symbol after execute this Ruby code and then put the return value into the document. So you can see that it's using this to put in the metadata for this particular page. You can have do and end blocks, which can surround a particular set of HTML or whatever. Or you can have one-off things, like if I just wanted to say, if I wanted to see to render the value of the @view instance variable, I could do that. So, which brings up a really important piece about like, how do you get data from the controller to the view? It happens through instance variables. So whatever instance variables are available to this method, this controller action, are also available to the view that it renders. So @reading list items index is going to be available. The @view variable that we declared earlier is going to be available, and the @secured Algolia key is going to be are all available. And we're going to see what it does with that in a second. But if I wanted to put this in the HTML somehow, and this is not not good, but I'm just gonna say we wanted to make the value of this instance variable a header, right? We could do h1 tags and then do a visible ERB tag, and it's going to take this, interpolate it, and then put it back in here. So in our case, it's going to be valid. If we went to the normal reading list route, or it might be archive. And basically, the ERB file, when it's rendering it, it goes through, it executes all of the Ruby tags, the ERB tags, and then either takes them out or renders them, so that all that's left is HTML, or and whatever else, CSS, JavaScript, and then makes that the body of the HTTP response that gets sent back to the client's browser. So in this case, it's going to render the meta content. We put a couple divs in here, which are empty. You can see that it has a couple data attributes on this div, one of which renders the value of @secured Algolia key, and data-view, which renders the @view. I'm assuming that this gets used by JavaScript later, but I haven't personally dived past this layer, except for figuring out where this goes, which I'm going to get into in a second. But questions?
That makes sense to me. I think one of the useful points Phil and Ali were explaining from this to me that really helped me understand it was, in JavaScript, there's like always the like communication between files was very weird when I came over to Ruby files, because in JavaScript you always have imports and exports, right? And Ruby, that seems like there's a lot of communication between files just based on your file path names, and things like that, which kind of stood out to me when it came to some of these like import variables you got here.
Yeah. And it might have got mentioned at the very beginning, but the whole application folder gets loaded. So everything within the application folder would know about everything else in the application folder. Doesn't mean that they have access, but all the files know that the other files exist.
Right, which is the differentiator from JavaScript, where even if they're in the same folder,
yeah.
Yes. So Zoom's going to kick us out in 6 minutes. So we are going to get into the handoff to React. So we have this cool thing here. So this is a visible ERB tag. So this is going to get whatever the output of this is going to get rendered. It calls the JavaScript pack tag method, and this is another thing about Ruby that I didn't mention, but in many cases, so Ruby is very forgiving when it comes to syntax. Sometimes so much so that it's confusing when you're looking at it if you haven't learned the different things that it allows you to do. One of the things that allows you to do is not put parentheses around its arguments. So here, what's most likely happening is this. So these are the arguments that are being passed to a method called JavaScript pack tag. So I'm going to do a find all in project for this, and we're going to, yeah, there's a lot of stuff.
From my understanding, that's like a Webpack component they've incorporated, and I'm going to go into that one a little bit tomorrow.
Yep, exactly. So yes, it's probably something that we're not going to find because it's provided by a gem. And because it's provided by a gem, we're not going to find the source code for that gem within our app directory. Yeah, but like Joel said, you can find, and this is how I figured out what was going on. JavaScript pack tag comes from Webpacker, and it is going to mount components, which can be found in app/JavaScript. So we're going to go here. We're going to look at, okay, we need to look for a reading list component. We're going to go to app/JavaScript. And there is a reading list directory within which is a reading list.jsx. And you have beautiful, lovely React code in all of its glory, which is
So-
where I will.
Experience with paired.
Yes, this was learning how to figure out what the heck was going on was a lot of fun. And I don't want to steal Joel's thunder because he said he wants to tell us all about this tomorrow, which I'm really looking forward to. But a couple things to look for in here if you want to start tracing for front end folk, back end folks. Tracing like what other files should I get from here. At the top of React components, you're going to have a lot of import lines, and you can, and they're very descriptive. So you're going to import this thing from this file. These ones at the top are probably going to be, especially because they're not prepended with like what folder to look in. These are going to be the central Preact libraries and other packages. But when you get down here, you start to get full file paths for where to look for stuff. So you can see all these other components that are getting loaded from this file path. So this is, go up one directory, go into source, go into components, go into item list, and we can trace this right now. Components, item list, item, and you can start to trace like all the stuff that's involved in this particular component. So that was just that's a little taster. But this is where that's all getting loaded. And then those in turn, I believe, are going to be used to render stuff and also to latch onto these divs. Is that correct? Or are these divs mostly being used for formatting? Can you front it, folks?
Yeah, they'll like go add and populate things to certain containers and trigger off calls to different routes, which go back down the cycle you've just been going through.
Sweet.
Dive into that a bit tomorrow.
Yes. All right, and we're about to get kicked out. If anybody's getting like fatigued from this and want to duck out, you can, but I'm going to do one more, I think probably one more 40-minute sprint on models so you can understand what's happening with the interactions with the database. I'm going to go ahead and close this preemptively to make the recording end a little bit more cleanly than the last one, but I am going to start a new session and drop another link.
Cool.
Cool. Thanks,
Sweet.
Danny.
Yep.
Good.
Thanks, Danny.